For Europe, Morecambe Oceanarium, a copy of an idea that's still very much in business on the other side of the Atlantic. They've already slipped into a 3 times a day routine with this Lancashire version of an all-American idea that's livening up seaside entertainment in the northwest, especially when the dolphins show some of their strange and endearing talents. As if you didn't know, dolphins are actually toothed whales, and there's reason to believe they might be the most intelligent of all the mammals, apart from man. They certainly seem to have a sense of humor and enjoy learning to play such fun and games. Everyone's very much on the ball here at Morecambe with a routine that rarely fails to score. They say dolphins even talk, only to each other, of course, but there's really nothing like a whole family of chimps for real expertise in the art of aping their human cousins in the family of man. Just making sure it's all good, clean fun.
So, as I said then, we're looking at dolphinaria in Britain, and in particular, the story of Rocky the Dolphin, quite a famous individual. Activists tried and sadly failed to liberate him, and this is when Rocky had already been imprisoned for 17 years and made to do tricks for humans. Now, one part of this story which is extraordinary is the lengths to which the dolphin exploiters went to keep their exploitative activities intact. In terms of resources, the main ones are these. So this is Alan Cooper. Alan Cooper has got a lot to do with this story. And so he's got a campaign for the abolition of animal slavery. And you can still find that online. So it's a bit of a basic website, but it's still there and you can still see quite a lot. So this one is much more detailed, I think. You can see there in the left there, it goes all the way down. There's also one of the tags there, which is called Custer's Last Stand by Doug Cartledge. I'm going to read a couple of bits from that out a little later. And then finally, a Mel Broughton audio. So this is from the Radicals and Revolutionaries series. The Radicals and Revolutionaries series, I think they're in about series 2 now. But I think in between 1 and 2, they did some short programs in which they focused in on one particular aspect. And so this was one of those. So we're talking about the history of 6 shows in Britain. One was in Knowlesley, Whipsnade another, then Morecambe, which is the one that we're focused on. And that was supposed to be the first in Europe from 1964. Brighton, Windsor, and Flamingo Land, which is in North Yorkshire. So as I said, the Marineland in Morecambe was reckoned to be the first oceanarium in the whole of Europe and opened in 1964. It closed in 1990 and it was demolished in 1992. This is the arrival of the other animal prisoners. It's detailed in this cutting from the Miami News from May 1964. They called it the Ark of the Sky because they sent so many other animals over. They collected them all in Miami at first and then they sent them over to Britain. And also in this book by this fairly disgusting individual called Captain William Gray, tells a story of the specimens being taken from Miami to England, including 6 porpoises, sea turtles, 150 reef fishes, reptiles, birds, and other animals, which are often not only called specimens, but also quite often called cargo. As for Rocky himself, Rocky was captured in April 1971 off the so-called Florida Panhandle. and transported to Morecambe Marineland later that year. He was 2 years old at the time, measured just a little less than 6 feet long. I think he might have grown a little bit more, but not much. And he subsequently languished in this concrete prison for over 18 years. So we've got a couple of shots of it. I did actually have a very clear picture of the entire thing, but for some reason it wouldn't show up on the PowerPoint. So I had to ditch it and just go back to this shot here. So this is the main couple of pools. As you can see, it's not particularly big. And in fact, if you look at this, then the dolphinarium is at the top there, the one with the roof, as it were. And you can see that the human swimming pool is bigger than the dolphinarium. So that, in a sense, tells its own story about human priorities, etc., etc. What I'm going to do is talk about the attempted liberation, and then we're going to go back to the story of the closure of the entire industry. So this is Mel Broughton's account. First of all, he said that he actually lived as far away from the ocean as you can imagine, but yet somebody went to him and proposed the idea of liberating a dolphin. At first, he thought it was a ridiculous idea, but the more that they talked about it, the more convinced Mel became that it was a possibility, not least because the people who were proposing it had charts and flow charts and tides and everything. With the tidal flows on these charts, it was seen that at the high tide, there was some channels a dolphin could easily negotiate in order to get out into open waters. And so Mel became convinced that this was a possibility and then went to have a look himself and then returned again with a team of people. So Marineland is part of Morecambe Bay, and at high tide, the water in the dolphin prison was only a few meters away from the open sea. They thought that if they could gain the trust of Rocky, then he might help them help him to escape. One way of gaining his trust was they swam with him. They made a stretcher. So the idea was that they were going to try and get him onto this stretcher. They had slits in it for his fins and all this kind of stuff. There was a large capture net already there for emergencies. So they thought that they could use that as well. One problem, of course, was the fact that Rocky was very heavy, about 600 old pounds. I'm not quite sure how that translates into anything else. They essentially bought bags of cement to that weight in order to test the stretcher. And they found that it worked. And so the plan was kind of on. It was just a question of whether they thought all the pieces could fit together, that the stretcher would work, that Rocky in particular would trust them. So the team arrived on the night of the liberation. It was high tide. Everything was set. But this is where you probably expect this. It went wrong because Rocky wouldn't really cooperate. And in particular, he didn't want to get put into a net. But they tried and tried for a good couple of hours. Then they took a break and tried to regroup and think again and see what else might be done. And in that time, somebody at a local hotel, which was overlooking the area, so presumably in terms of this picture, as it were, behind the camera, presumably, they had spotted them and had rung the police. And so then we had a Hollywood kind of chase and they were captured. And of course, they were charged with property theft, attempted theft of property being Rocky, to the value of £25,000. Which in 1988 was a lot of money and still is. So they decided then that we'll go to court and we'll put dolphinariums on trial by exposing it, essentially the kind of usual kind of thing that people do once they're arrested, arguing that the injustice of what was going on justified their actions, but they were found guilty, of course, again, as you'd expect, because as we know, the law is mainly there to protect property. So this is a press cutting from the time. After a 5-day trial, they were convicted of conspiracy to steal the animal, the property. So Barry Horn, Jim O'Donnell Mel Broughton and Jim Buckner. They were fined £500, and Barry and Mel were given an additional 6-month suspended sentence. We now get into the move to try and just close them down in a more kind of conventional way. It was early March 1990, and the Morecambe Dolphin campaign was about to be officially launched, and the plan was to close down the dolphinarium. And it started with a march and rally organised by students in the town. It was fairly well attended for the time. About 300 people attended the rally, and there were speeches from someone called Doug Cartledge, I mentioned before, and Dr. Horace Dobbs. Both Cartledge and Dobbs were to play a big part in the ending of Dolphinaria. Later, they become a big part of the story a little later on. Cartledge was an ex-dolphin trainer, but had become disillusioned with the profession and was later to become a useful ally in the campaigns to close all the British dolphin shows. He actually lived in the south of England, and so he played a big part in closing down the dolphinarium in the Brighton area. In terms of the campaign, the prime movers were the Manchester Animal Rights Movement, which then moved to Lancashire, and Alan Cooper writes. Now, I'm not using this person's name, the one that Alan is talking about. I'm not using their name because they also appeared on the Radicals and Revolutionaries podcast, but they didn't want to be named, and so therefore I won't name them either. So Alan Cooper writes, I knew her from days and actions with the Northern Animal Liberation League. In fact, we had both been imprisoned along with 25 others for a raid on Unilever Labs in 1984. They knew each other, and they got involved with the kind of legit campaign to close the dolphinariums down. One part of this story is the fact that there was incredible dirty tricks going on behalf of the people who had enslaved the dolphins. Not least, there was an allegation of, it's kind of like a sexual allegation against Alan Cooper. He was one of the main organisers of the demos. And there was 2 people that he remembers seeing, and he thinks part of this kind of setup to discredit him. One was called Neil Hope, and one was called Paul Wabber. They'd seen each other around a place called Amble. Later on, Alan Cooper was to find that they were kind of sly characters, and they were submitting reports to Peter Bloom, who was a dolphin trainer. He becomes one of the big defenders of dolphinariums in this story as well. And Alan Cooper used to like to swim with free-living dolphins, and in particular, a free-living dolphin known as Freddie. And then one day, Alan was swimming with Freddie, and Wabber swam up to him and accused him of being a pervert. Okay, so this is going back to Mel Broughton's account, saying that many underhand things were happening as part of these campaigns. And the idea was to discredit the anti-dolphinarium campaign and also individual campaigners. Mel said that Alan was very fit and did endurance events like cycling the length and breadth of the country. He was part of the football team that beat the miners in a charity match during the miners' strike, which I've mentioned before. And so there was a feeling that he'd been set up, really, by the dolphin trainers and ended up being arrested and charged with what was called in those days committing a lewd, obscene and disgusting act and outraging public decency. Part of Peter Bloom's police statement, you won't get near because he's wanking off the dolphin. So I'm going to come back to dolphin penises in a while. Alan was acquitted. There's a little chart of what went on in this kind of discrediting sequence, if you like, completely extraordinary events. So we're talking about April to December 1991. So you've got the Yorkshire Evening Press, and that's all of their reports reading downwards. And then the other ones where it says Express, Today, Northern Echo, The Star, that's other newspapers as well. In terms of dolphin penises, they use their penis almost like an arm sometimes. And so they will hook people or other beings in the water with their penis. It's not used for sexual reasons at this stage. It's used essentially as a like a kind of surrogate arm in a way. And so this was what they were trying to use against Alan to discredit him by exposing the fact that when Freddie had been swimming, sometimes his penis was exposed, which apparently, according to dolphin experts, I don't know this, so don't ask me. According to dolphin experts, that's pretty standard stuff. So back to the campaign then. There was a possibility at this stage that the Morecambe campaign to free Rocky was starting to work, and it was starting to get some tractions. And in fact, it got to the stage where the prime mover I mentioned before had a meeting with the owner of the company that owned Rocky, and they had agreed to let him go. The next question was what to do with the released dolphin. And so this became a big kind of concern, and this is where some national organizations got involved. One was called ZooCheck, which I think ZooCheck is still around, Care for the Wild, and also the Bella Reeve Foundation, which I don't know anything about. So these groups together, they formed the Into the Blue project, it was called. They searched around the world and located a suitable rehabilitation site for ex-captive dolphins in the Turks and Caicos Islands, which is in the British West Indies. So they also had expert vets. They had these ex-trainers who would help and supervise. The Mail on Sunday launched an Into the Blue campaign with a series of articles asking the public to fund the campaign and to get behind the idea of dolphin liberation, and over £100,000 was raised. By this stage, the real problem became actually physically getting Rocky from Morecambe, and in particular from his so-called trainer, as a guy called John Braithwaite. For example, in November 1990, on the pretext that the heating in the pool in Morecambe had failed, and that could have been true in the sense that it happened before, the Braithwaite, on this pretext, removed Rocky to Flamingo Land in Yorkshire, as I mentioned before. Now, this is where Peter Bloom, the person who tried to discredit Alan Cooper, was the trainer. So it's all starting to fit together. Peter Bloom happened to have 3 captive female dolphins in Flamingo Land. Essentially, Rocky became a convenient stud animal for them. So the Flamingo Land dolphin campaign was also launched in April 1991. After the successful rescue, or at least the proposed rescue of Rocky, had already been done by then. It's just that he'd been moved. Just reading then from Custer's Last Stand by Doug Cartledge. He says, in recent weeks, it's early 1990s, Pride, ZooCheck and marine mammal consultant Doug Cartledge had been working around the clock to set up the Turks and Caicos Rehabilitation and Release Centre, the first candidate to be reunited to its natural habitat should have been Rocky. But when the widespread public support, and armed with a CITES paper, this is a legal paper to do with conservation, and High Court writs, they discovered that even their best laid plans can be spiked by an industry which was becoming increasingly desperate to survive. In late October, after more than 3 months of tense and at times very complex negotiations, the future of Rocky the Dolphin was finally settled, or so they thought. But he said even before the ink had dried on the agreement, and only hours before they were due to bring their own experienced team to aid deliberation, Rocky's trainer, this John Braithwaite, had done this secret move. Carty said some bizarre press reports began to circulate, claiming that Rocky was ill, and then even that he was in love with these 3 female dolphins. By this time, ZooCheck was Rocky's legal guardian, being given legal guardianship by the courts. And Peter Bloom had promised that if presented with the correct papers, he would help prepare and load Rocky for transportation. Zoocheck had to get a world-renowned dolphin expert who was called Dick Boos. I think it's Boos. I'm going to say Boos. He was an expert in cetacean transportation. He was employed by the oceanarium industry in the United States. And Dr. Boos was contracted to give his professional advice. Essentially, he was there to ascertain whether Rocky was fit to travel. If he was deemed healthy, Boos was there to supervise the entire journey. So this was the setup. So Dr. Boos examined Rocky and informed everybody that Rocky was indeed fit to travel. The Zoocheck transport team arrived at the main gates of Flamingo Land Zoo at 3:15 p.m. on Saturday, December the 1st. Security staff refused to allow them to enter the zoo grounds. And they did that even though they were shown legal documentation to say what was going on. Mel Broughton and a group of people arrived, and a fracas started, and in fact, an entire kind of fight broke out. Eventually, things calmed down, and the deal was then that Dr. Boos on his own would be allowed to enter to find out what was going on with Rocky. Zoocheck requested that someone else goes with Boos in order to act as a witness, but this was denied. So to prevent delay and to attempt to discover what was going on with Rocky, Dr. Boos agreed to go in alone. And so this is a part of the account in Custer's Last Stand. What happened to Dick Boos from then on is something I personally will never forget or forgive the industry for, especially Peter Bloom. For the moment he entered the dolphinarium, Boos was subjected to verbal threats and abuse from some of those present. He spent long periods on the telephone explaining to some of his clients in North America why he was working for us. So another part of the dirty tricks thing is that the people in Britain had contacted the people that Boos worked for in the States and said, do you know that your guy is working for the enemy, as it were? Independent observers from a group called British Divers Marine Rescue witnessed extreme pressure being exerted on Boos. However, he maintained that Rocky was indeed fit to travel. For me, Doug Cartledge wrote, Dick Boos's conduct in the face of such hostility was that of an honourable and courageous man, and that in itself is something the rest of the industry should benefit from. Suddenly, a Minister of Fisheries and Food, just kind of known as MAF in those days, a vet from there suddenly was present at the dolphinarium and declared that Rocky was unfit to travel. It transpired that the vet from the MAF was in fact someone called Mr. Harvey Pickup, who was also the vet for Flamingo Land Zoo. So things again were still getting a bit kind of tricky. It seems that Rocky was subject to a whole host of blood tests as different vets tried to slow proceedings down or to have everything cancelled. Mr. Pickup, for example, was apparently concerned that Rocky's white cell count was high. Cartledge said, well, this is because of Rocky was stressed after his secret move from Morecambe to Yorkshire. And now they were trying to use the thing that they did themselves against Rocky's departure, as it were. Pickup had the power to impose restrictions on the blood sampling in terms of where it could be analysed. And this further delayed things. So blood samples ended up being sent all around the north of England to various labs. And so it would seem that Rocky was being used like a pincushion at this point. Cartledge said it was obviously a deliberate attempt to prevent Rocky's planned departure. Then Zoocheck were informed that their transport lorry was too large, and so therefore it wouldn't be allowed near the dolphinarium. And so by midnight, they'd hired a second transporter, which was smaller. Then Dr. Boos was told that he could not carry out any further veterinary treatment on Rocky indeed including taking blood samples which were necessary to declare him fit because he was, quote, not qualified to practice in the UK. And Cartledge complains that Peter Bloom, who had no veterinary qualifications whatsoever, was allowed to take blood samples. And it was his results that were being used to delay Rocky's departure. ZooCheck had gone to the trouble of finding a reputable laboratory willing to open specially for them in the night, as it were. And they even borrowed a blood centrifuge from Scarborough Hospital in order to do blood tests themselves. But now there were some further blocks. They were essentially banned from the zoo grounds whatsoever. Although they had the documentation that they needed, they then had to go to a high court to get a writ to be allowed to get inside. Eventually, they obtained this writ. So at 1 a.m., after being there from 3 p.m. the previous day, and armed with this High Court writ, there was one last-ditch effort, really, to get to Rocky. At this point, the team were physically attacked by the park's security people, and Cartledge says, once out of sight of the main gates and away from the lights of the attendant TV crews, we were attacked by zoo staff who came out of the bushes and from behind fences. The first person to be injured was a photographer from the Mail on Sunday. He was hit in the mouth and his camera equipment was damaged. Just to drop back, because this reminded me, just to drop back to the sexual pervert story, people who gave evidence against Alan Cooper in court, one of which was a journalist who said that he was with 3 people and he saw this perversion going on, but he was so shocked he'd forgotten to write all the details down. And the photographer that was with him had forgotten to take any photographs because they were so shocked. Okay, going back to the zoo then, Cartledge said other members of our party were punched and kicked. It was obvious that to continue would result in serious injuries, so we decided to withdraw back to the main gate and the safety of the television cameras. So Rocky did not depart for his well-deserved retirement on time, but eventually it all came together, and on the 13th of January, Rocky was eventually freed and taken to Manchester Airport. And courtesy of British Airways, he was flown to Caracas and then put on board a specially chartered aircraft for the last leg of the journey to his new home in the Turks and Caicos Islands. There is no kind of, if you like, incredibly happy ending because the fate of Rocky is contested, essentially, with some people saying that he was seen around this area for a long, long time afterwards, and other people claiming that he disappeared. And I think there was some claims that he was found injured or even dead. So the actual fate of Rocky is rather unclear and just goes to show how incredibly difficult it is that when you have an individual who is stolen from the free living situation as a youngster and then spends 18 years in prison, which is longer than most people spend for murder, it's very, very difficult then to secure their return to civi land, I would think. So the final word goes to Alan Cooper, and this is about movement politics, really. He says, after putting the phone down with Doug, I quickly phoned all the press I could think of to give them quotes. And this is when they would finally got the liberation of Rocky secured. I had seen it happen before, and grassroots activists were not duly given the credit they deserved, and all the credit had been hijacked by national organisations, by professionals, the likes of which you never saw on a picket line, holding banners or giving out leaflets, yet they were always on the front lines for the credit and the windfall of public subscriptions that came with it. One prime example was that during Into the Blue, the Morecambe and Brighton Dolphin campaigns, I felt that the grassroots were never attributed the credit due. If we, the grassrooters, as you put it, the grassrooters, hadn't have started up the campaign, I know with almost near certainty that Rocky, Miss or Missy and Silver, so these were other eventually liberated beings, would have shared the fate of the dolphins at Flamingo Land. In other words, kept in captivity and never freed. Yet Into the Blue was all about Zoocheck and others. I wouldn't have minded that at all if they'd done the basic manners to mention us, the grassroots, in the press, on TV, and in videos that were made. Okay, I'm going to end with some reminiscing from a guy who worked at Marineland, and he featured in a vlog. This guy worked at Marineland for 20 years.
He did 20 years?
Yeah. Funnily enough, 60 years ago about now, the first idea came for Marineland. It was through George Cansdale, who was superintendent at London Zoo and wrote a lot of books and articles. He was like the Chris Packham of the day, if you follow me. And Robert Jackson, who was to do with the Welsh Mountain Zoo, decided to make a company and open the first oceanarium in Europe at Morecambe, of all places, which they did. It took a few years to actually make, but they opened in 1964. The first year it opened, there was 400,000 paying customers, which, when you think about it now, is ridiculously high. This puts us through to maybe the early 80s, when animal rights people were stood outside saying how cruel we were. I don't know whether you remember that, they're all with the placards.
No, I don't remember that.
They were actually paid to their expenses from Lancaster University to come down. Well, all the students thought we're on a good thing here, we'll join in, and they got their expenses from Lancaster University for that. One of the councillors, Councillor Hennick, I think he became an MP at one time, stood up in the council and said, people don't come to Morecambe because of Marineland and that dolphin. Bearing in mind, they owned it themselves a few months earlier, so they really stuck the knife in and twisted it.
Yes.
Protesters and falling attendances signalled an end to approximately after 23 years in captivity. Rocky the Dolphin was released in the ocean to the Turks and Caicos Islands. I often thought when he was actually caught in the Gulf of Mexico, which isn't too far from the Turks and Caicos. And when Marineland actually closed, I had thousands of animals to find homes for. And it was breaking my heart. So 91 and 92, I was finding homes for alligators, turtles, thousands of fish, which was a problem, as you can imagine.
So what would you say one of your best memories of working there was?
Saturday morning, when the children from, it was called the Cinderella Home at the time, they were children that didn't have much, and they all used to come down on Saturday morning getting free, and they all used to get really excited. Sometimes they were that excited they had to go to the toilet quick. But they'd never seen anything like it, and they really did enjoy themselves.
That's so cool.
Hand in hand and all come walking in for a free show on Saturday morning. That was, I used to enjoy that.
That's so
I think it was watching the children enjoy it that I missed, really.
Yeah.
I think times have changed. I can understand dolphins not being in captivity, but it was a product of its times, and it was well run.
Just to pick up on what Andy's saying, entire life taken from him. Yeah, well, it's a story that we know over and over, of course, sadly. Also, Deb is basically saying that this is the Alan Cooper comment about the movement thing. We experienced that here in Arizona during the wildfire season. We locals would be on the front lines helping to evacuate and care for the animals affected, and large organizations later swooped in, and I think it says to claim the credit. This has been going on for many, many years, and of course it still goes on in the internet age when the grassroots end up being free labor for the national groups in a sense. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you again.